The sentence that changed a $500 million deal was spoken by someone no one in that room was even supposed to hear. In a glass-walled executive conference suite overlooking Manhattan, where the city lights shimmered like a promise of absolute control, Billionaire CEO William Harrington leaned back in his chair as if the outcome had already been decided. On the polished mahogany table in front of him lay a contract marked with red tabs, financial projections stretching across multiple continents, and a single figure that silenced hesitation before it could form: $500 million. Around him sat his legal advisor Daniel Reed, two senior executives from Harrington Global, and a corporate translator named Emily Foster, who was tasked with ensuring every line of the Japanese acquisition agreement aligned perfectly with their expectations. No one questioned the structure of the deal. No one questioned William Harrington. He had built his reputation on certainty, on deals that closed before doubt had time to breathe. In the corner of the room, nearly invisible against the neutral walls and the quiet professionalism of the environment, Jasmine Carter stood with a tray of freshly poured coffee cups, her presence so understated it was almost designed to disappear. She was 23, a black waitress working part-time at the hotel where elite business meetings were held like rituals of power. No one asked her opinion. No one expected her to understand anything beyond where to place a cup without interrupting ambition. And Jasmine had learned the rules of invisibility well enough to survive inside them. The meeting continued with calm confidence as Emily began reading sections of the Japanese contract aloud, her tone steady but slightly rushed, as if the language itself was something to be processed rather than understood. William Harrington tapped his pen once against the table, approving, impatient, ready to finalize. "We are aligned," he said, not as a question but as a conclusion. "Let's move forward." A few polite nods followed, the kind that confirm power more than truth. Jasmine, moving silently near the sideboard, paused for half a second when she heard a specific phrase in Japanese slip through Emily's translation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was subtle, like a misaligned note in a familiar song. Her eyes shifted toward the document without permission, reading the visible lines from a distance she was not supposed to care about. Emily continued, unaware, translating a clause that sounded harmless, procedural even. But Jasmine's expression changed, not with emotion, but with recognition. A pattern she had seen before. A structure of language that did not match its supposed meaning. She placed the tray down gently, the sound barely noticeable against the hum of the city beyond the glass. For a moment, the room remained untouched, suspended in its confidence. William Harrington was already reaching for his pen when Jasmine spoke. Her voice was calm, almost neutral, lacking any trace of urgency or performance, as if she were simply correcting something factual in the air. "That's not what it says." The words did not echo. They didn't need to. They landed softly, yet everything in the room subtly recalibrated around them. Pens paused midair. Eyes shifted without instruction. Emily frowned slightly, rechecking the line she had just translated. William Harrington did not move at first. He simply looked at her, as if trying to place where her voice belonged in a room like this. Jasmine didn't step forward. She didn't raise her tone. She simply continued, her gaze steady on the document she had not been invited to read. The Japanese clause doesn't authorize equal transfer. It limits controlled distribution under a secondary shell agreement. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structural, like something in the room had lost its assumed foundation. Daniel Reed leaned in slightly, scanning the document again, slower this time. Emily's confidence faltered as she flipped back to the original text, her translation now feeling incomplete in a way she could not immediately explain. William Harrington finally leaned forward, his expression tightening not with anger, but with the first trace of uncertainty he had shown all morning. And for the first time since the meeting began, the number 500 million no longer felt like a conclusion, but like a question that had not been fully understood. For a moment after her words settled into the room, no one moved. The air in the executive suite felt different, as if the structure of certainty that had supported every decision inside it had shifted by a fraction of an inch. William Harrington slowly set his pen down on the table, not because he was finished, but because something about the rhythm of the meeting no longer allowed him to continue. His eyes remained fixed on Jasmine Carter, who still stood near the sideboard with the same calm posture. as if she had not just interrupted a $500 million assumption with a single sentence. Emily Foster adjusted her grip on the printed pages of the contract, her eyes scanning the Japanese text again, but now with a visible hesitation that had not existed moments earlier. Daniel Reed leaned closer, his brow tightening as he followed each line more carefully, as if reading for the first time instead of confirming what he already believed. William Harrington exhaled slowly, controlled, but there was a subtle change in the way he held himself, a slight forward lean that suggested the conversation was no longer moving in the direction he had designed. "Explain that again," he said, his voice measured but no longer dismissive. Jasmine did not rush. She did not attempt to fill the silence with urgency or emotion. Instead, she stepped forward just one pace, enough to be closer to the table without crossing any visible boundary that might have reminded anyone she did not officially belong there. Her eyes moved briefly to the contract, then back to Emily. "The phrase used here does not indicate shared control," she said calmly. "It establishes conditional limitation under a secondary entity that overrides the primary agreement." Emily blinked, then quickly flipped back to the original Japanese page. Her lips moved slightly as she reread the clause, this time slower, as if the language itself had changed since the last reading. "That is not how it was translated," Emily said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Daniel Reed reached for a second copy of the document, comparing sections side by side. The sound of paper shifting became unusually noticeable in the silence. William Harrington's gaze did not leave Jasmine. It was no longer the gaze of a man waiting for confirmation. It was the gaze of someone recalculating probability in real time. "You are saying there is a structural error in the translation," he said. Jasmine nodded once. "It is not an error in translation," she replied. "It is a selective interpretation of intent." That distinction changed the atmosphere in the room more than any accusation could have. Selective interpretation implied design. It implied purpose. It implied that nothing they were looking at was accidental. Emily's hands tightened slightly around the pages. "I translated this myself," she said, her voice steady but defensive. "Line by line." Jasmine gave a small nod, not challenging her directly. "Then the original wording must be reviewed against context, not just structure," she said. William Harrington leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the translator and the waitress. The idea that someone outside the formal structure of the meeting could recognize a discrepancy that had escaped professionals did not align with his expectations of how systems worked. Yet the document in front of them remained unchanged, and that was the problem. Daniel Reed finally spoke, his tone careful. "If what she is suggesting is accurate, then the controlling clause is not what we believed it to be." The word believed hung in the air longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. William Harrington's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. For the first time since the meeting began, he picked up the contract himself and began reading the Japanese lines directly, bypassing the translation entirely. The room remained still as he scanned the text. The silence stretched, not empty, but weighted with attention. When he reached the specific clause Jasmine had referenced, his expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to notice. It was the expression of someone recognizing that a decision made too quickly might have been built on incomplete understanding. He looked up slowly, and for the first time, he did not speak immediately. The silence that followed William Harrington's change in expression was not empty, but dense with recalculation. His eyes remained locked on the Japanese text as if the words had begun to shift their meaning under closer inspection. Around him, the room that had once felt like a controlled negotiation space now carried a different weight, as though every line of the contract had become subject to interpretation rather than acceptance. Emily Foster stood still, her earlier confidence now replaced by a careful stillness, watching William's reaction with growing uncertainty. Daniel Reed kept his attention on the document, but his posture had changed, leaning in closer as if physical proximity to the text could stabilize its meaning. Jasmine Carter remained near the sideboard, her presence unchanged, steady, almost detached from the shift she had initiated. William finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried finality. "This clause," he said slowly, tapping a section of the document with controlled precision, "appears to limit direct transfer authority to a secondary holding structure not listed in the executive summary." The phrasing itself revealed something important. He was no longer confirming a deal. He was dissecting it. Emily quickly responded, her tone careful but defensive. That section was translated based on the standard corporate framework provided in the briefing documents. Jasmine's gaze moved toward Emily briefly before returning to the table. Standard frameworks do not always capture conditional language embedded in legal Japanese structures, she said calmly. Her tone remained neutral, not confrontational, but absolute in its clarity. The room tightened further. Daniel flipped to a cross-referenced page, comparing clauses in silence, his eyes moving faster now, searching for consistency rather than confirmation. William Harrington leaned forward again, this time more deliberately, scanning the Japanese characters line by line. The confidence that had defined his posture earlier in the meeting had not disappeared entirely, but it had fractured into something more cautious. If this interpretation is accurate, William said, pausing between each phrase, then the valuation model attached to this acquisition is based on incomplete control assumptions. The phrase incomplete control hung in the air like a structural fault line. Emily's expression shifted slightly, her professional composure beginning to show strain. That is not possible, she said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. Jasmine did not react to the statement. Instead, she stepped slightly closer to the table again, not intruding, but positioning herself within the line of sight of the document. It is not a matter of possibility, she said. It is a matter of reading sequence. The controlling phrase appears in the third conditional layer, not the first. Daniel looked up at her now, his expression no longer dismissive. You are saying the translation reversed the hierarchy of control language, he said carefully. Jasmine nodded once. Yes, that changes the entire structure of authority in the agreement. William Harrington placed the document flat on the table with deliberate care. The sound was soft, but it carried a sense of finality shifting into suspension. He studied Jasmine for a long moment, not as someone interrupting a meeting, but as someone altering its foundation. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued its movement, unaware that inside this room, the definition of a $500 million decision was no longer stable. Emily finally spoke again, quieter now. If that hierarchy is reversed, then the controlling entity is not Harrington Global. No one responded immediately. The implication did not need repetition. Daniel slowly exhaled, his attention fixed on the clause again, rereading it with a different expectation. William Harrington remained still, his eyes narrowing slightly as the realization formed not as a conclusion, but as a question that required verification. And in that moment, Jasmine Carter, who had not been part of the negotiation, had become the only person in the room whose interpretation no one could afford to ignore. The atmosphere inside the glass conference suite had shifted into something far more fragile than disagreement. It was no longer about confidence or authority, but about the slow unraveling of assumptions that had been treated as fact only minutes earlier. William Harrington remained standing near the table, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the document, as if physical contact could stabilize the structure of meaning he was now trying to rebuild. His eyes moved across the Japanese text again, but this time without the certainty of ownership. Emily Foster stood slightly apart from the table, her earlier composure now replaced by a restrained tension in her posture, as she quietly re-examined sections she had already translated twice before. Daniel Reed had shifted into full analysis mode, comparing clauses across multiple printed pages, marking discrepancies with short, precise notes, his attention narrowing into detail rather than overview. Jasmine Carter remained where she had positioned herself earlier, neither closer nor farther from the table, her calm presence unchanged, as though she were observing a process she had already understood long before anyone else entered it. William finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before, measured but no longer anchored in certainty. If the controlling entity is not Harrington Global, he said slowly, then the acquisition structure itself may not be what we were led to believe. No one responded immediately. The weight of the statement did not require interruption to be felt. Emily glanced at him, then back at the document. The translation I provided was consistent with the briefing terms we received from the Japanese legal team, she said, though the phrasing now sounded more procedural than confident. Jasmine's attention shifted slightly toward the document again. Briefing terms often summarize intent, she said calmly, but they do not always preserve hierarchical language within conditional clauses. Daniel looked up from his notes. Hierarchical language, he repeated, as if testing whether the phrase matched what he was seeing. Jasmine nodded once. In this case, the third conditional layer defines control, not the primary statement. That inversion changes authority entirely. William slowly stepped closer to the table, his eyes narrowing as he followed the structure she described. The room felt smaller now, not physically but perceptually, as if every sentence spoken was compressing the space between certainty and doubt. You are stating that the effective control does not originate from the entity listed in the executive summary, William said carefully. Jasmine responded without hesitation. Yes, the executive summary reflects intent framing. The operative clause assigns authority elsewhere. Emily turned a page quickly, her movements more urgent now. Then, that would mean the valuation model attached to this agreement is not aligned with the actual controlling structure, she said, her voice tightening slightly as she processed the implication in real time. Daniel's pen paused mid-note. That would also mean the risk distribution was calculated under incorrect assumptions, he added quietly. The phrase risk distribution lingered longer than expected. William placed both hands on the table now, leaning forward as he read again, this time focusing on the smallest linguistic markers, the conditional phrases, the structural connectors that had previously been absorbed into translation without challenge. His expression remained controlled, but the certainty that had defined his earlier presence had shifted into something more analytical, more cautious. If this is accurate, he said finally, then the $500 million valuation is based on a structural misinterpretation of authority. No one contradicted him. The absence of contradiction itself became its own form of confirmation. Jasmine did not step forward or emphasize her point further. She simply remained still, allowing the document to speak through its structure rather than interpretation. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, reviewing her own translation with visible recalibration. Daniel continued scanning, now searching not for agreement, but for verification of error boundaries. William Harrington straightened slowly, his eyes moving from the document back to Jasmine. For the first time since the meeting began, his attention was no longer directed toward controlling the outcome, but toward understanding how the outcome had shifted without his awareness. And in that quiet recalibration, the presence of the waitress in the room was no longer perceived as an interruption, but as the only variable that had revealed the system was never as fixed as it appeared. The realization inside the glass conference suite did not settle as agreement, but as a shifting instability that forced everyone present to reassess what they thought they were holding. William Harrington stood in a position that no longer felt like command, but like evaluation, as his eyes moved repeatedly between the Japanese text and the annotations Daniel Reed had begun marking in short, precise strokes. The confidence that once defined his posture had not disappeared entirely, but it had fractured into layers of analysis, each one demanding verification before the next could be trusted. Emily Foster remained silent for several seconds longer than before, her attention fixed on the translated pages as if searching for the exact moment where meaning had diverged from intention. Jasmine Carter, still near the sideboard, observed without urgency, her calmness unchanged, as though the unfolding reassessment was something she had already mapped long before it became visible to anyone else in the room. William finally broke the silence again, but his tone was no longer assertive. It carried the weight of controlled uncertainty. If the operative clause is located in the conditional third layer, he said slowly, then the controlling authority is structurally independent from the entity we are negotiating with. The phrasing no longer sounded like a statement of power. It sounded like a correction to reality. Daniel Reed looked up from the documents, his expression focused and tense. That would imply, he said carefully, that the acquisition target is not actually the final beneficiary of the capital structure. Emily exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, as she rechecked the Japanese text again. Her voice lowered when she spoke. Then the translation error is not linguistic, she said. It is structural interpretation. That distinction shifted the room again. Structural interpretation suggested not mistake, but design vulnerability. William's gaze sharpened slightly as he processed that implication. He turned one page back, then forward again, tracing the sequence of clauses as if reconstructing a chain that had already been executed without his awareness. Who had final review authority on this translation sequence? He asked, though the question was not directed at any one person. Emily responded immediately. The Japanese legal team provided the original draft. I applied the standard corporate conversion model used in all prior acquisitions. Jasmine's voice entered the conversation again, calm and precise. Standard conversion models assume symmetry in legal intent. Japanese contractual language does not always operate under symmetrical structure. William turned toward her now, studying her not as a peripheral presence, but as a critical variable that had not been accounted for. You are saying, he said slowly, that the system we use to interpret this agreement is incompatible with the way the agreement was written. Jasmine nodded once. Yes, and that incompatibility affects ownership interpretation. The word ownership hung in the air longer than anything else said in the room so far. Daniel adjusted his glasses slightly, then spoke with caution. If ownership interpretation is affected, then capital control distribution could be misaligned by the full value of the transaction. He did not need to say the number again. $500 million was already embedded in the silence. William stepped away from the table for the first time, walking slowly toward the glass wall that overlooked Manhattan. The city beyond continued without interruption, its movement indifferent to the recalibration happening inside the room. He placed one hand lightly against the glass, not as a gesture of contemplation, but as if anchoring himself to something outside the instability of interpretation. How long have you been able to read Japanese contract structure at this level? He asked without turning around. Jasmine paused before answering. Long enough to recognize when translation removes legal hierarchy. The answer was simple, but its implication was not. Emily lowered her eyes again, reviewing her work with a level of scrutiny that had not been present before. Daniel continued cross-checking clauses, now focused on structural sequencing rather than meaning alone. The meeting, which had begun as a finalization of a major acquisition, had transformed into a forensic examination of language itself. William finally turned back toward the table. His expression was no longer anchored in expectation, but in recalculation. Then we proceed differently, he said quietly. And for the first time since the meeting began, the authority in the room was no longer defined by who signed the contract, but by who understood what it truly meant. The shift inside the glass conference suite was no longer subtle. It had become structural, as if the room itself was reorganizing its understanding of what authority meant. William Harrington stood away from the table now, no longer anchored to the contract as a symbol of control, but instead watching it as a system under reconstruction. His attention was divided between the physical document and the implications it carried, as though each line of Japanese text had become a variable in an equation that no longer produced the expected result. Emily Foster remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the printed pages, but her eyes did not leave the clauses she had previously translated with confidence. That confidence had now been replaced by careful hesitation, as she re-examined sentence structures that once felt routine but now revealed layered conditional logic she had not fully accounted for. Daniel Reed continued his methodical review, marking and comparing sections with increasing precision, his earlier certainty replaced by a professional focus that bordered on urgency. Jasmine Carter remained standing near the sideboard, her posture unchanged, her presence steady and unforced, as if she were observing a system correcting itself rather than participating in its disruption. William finally spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate, shaped by recalibration rather than assertion. We need to determine whether the controlling clause was intentionally structured to separate legal ownership from operational authority, he said slowly. The statement was not directed at any one person, but it shifted the focus of the room into investigative alignment. Daniel responded without looking up immediately. If that separation exists, he said, then the valuation model is built on assumptions that do not reflect enforceable control. Emily nodded slightly, though her expression remained tense. That would also mean the translation framework we used did not preserve jurisdictional hierarchy, she added. The phrase jurisdictional hierarchy introduced a new layer of complexity into the room. It was no longer just about language accuracy. It was about legal architecture. William turned back toward the table and picked up the contract again, this time reading more slowly, as if each phrase required confirmation through structure rather than meaning. Who validated the final alignment between the Japanese draft and the English execution version? He asked, his tone now measured and procedural. Emily hesitated for a brief moment before answering. It was processed through standard multilingual compliance protocol, she said. No independent linguistic verification was requested beyond the corporate threshold. Jasmine's voice entered again, calm and precise. Standard protocols prioritize transactional consistency, she said, not embedded conditional authority. William looked toward her again, this time with a different kind of attention. It was no longer curiosity. It was evaluation. You are saying, he asked, that what we assumed to be a translation was actually a restructuring of meaning under legal constraint differences. Jasmine nodded once. Yes, and that restructuring changes who ultimately holds enforceable control. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that felt less like pause and more like absorption. Daniel leaned back slightly, processing the implication. Then the controlling entity may not be the acquisition target at all, he said slowly, as if testing the boundaries of the conclusion. Emily closed the document slightly, her fingers pressing against the edge as she absorbed the realization. William moved back toward the center of the room, no longer positioned at distance or dominance, but within the shared